Hello, my name is Michael DePrinzio, and for my project, I'll be exploring how fiscal policies have evolved, especially since the 2008 financial crisis and during the COVID 19 pandemic. I'll look at debates around government spending, stimuluses, debt, and their impacts on growth and inflation. I chose to focus on the 2008 financial crisis because of its massive, long lasting impacts on the global economy. Even today, economists and policymakers reference the decision made during that time. So let's just jump right into it. So, to start off, we have to explain what exactly is fiscal policy. So, fiscal policy is one of the main ways governments try to manage the economy. It refers to the use of government spending and taxation to influence the overall level of economic activity. The goal of fiscal policy is to keep the economy stable, promoting growth, lowering unemployment, and keeping inflation under control. There are two key tools. One is government spending, like building roads, funding schools, or giving out stimulus checks. The other is taxes, adjusting tax rates to influence how much money people and businesses have to spend. Fiscal policy becomes especially important during economic downturns, like the 2008 financial crisis, when governments use it to jumpstart growth and prevent deeper recessions. The 2008 financial crisis began with the collapse of the housing market and widespread defaults on subprime mortgages. This quickly spiraled into a global financial meltdown, freezing credit markets and pushing the U.S. economy into a deep recession. Unemployment rose to 10%, GDP contracted significantly, and millions of Americans lost their jobs, homes, and retirement savings. In response, the federal government passed major stimulus legislations, most notably the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, also known as the ARRA, to inject demand into the economy. The scale of the crisis and the response had long-lasting effects on how we view fiscal policy, debt, and the government's role in economic stabilization. In 2009, the Obama administration passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as I just talked about on the last slide, a $787 billion stimulus package meant to revive the economy. It included funding for infrastructure, education, unemployment, benefits, and tax cuts. But many economists argued that the stimulus was too small given the scale of the crisis. At the time, it was more politically viable than economically ideal. Additionally, while the federal government was injecting money into the economy, state and local governments were making major spending cuts, which almost completely offset the federal stimulus. This mismatch limited the impact of the ARRA. The stimulus helped prevent a deeper collapse, but it didn't create the kind of sustained economic momentum the U.S. needed. It's a key example of what some call a failure to try fiscal policy at full force. So, did fiscal policy work in 2008? The answer is partially. The stimulus prevented things from getting worse, but it wasn't strong enough to spark a full recovery. The main issue wasn't that the fiscal policy failed, it was that it wasn't used aggressively enough. As the article I read by The Economist explains, cuts by state and local governments canceled out much of the federal support, and by the time the stimulus wore off, the economy was still weak. Critics of the Obama stimulus often claimed it didn't work, but as The Economist argues, that misses the point. The real failure was not trying a large enough fiscal intervention. This debate continued for years, influencing how economists and policymakers would respond to future crises, like the pandemic in 2020. One of the most important long-term effects of the 2008 crisis was a shift in how economists think about debt. Traditionally, high government debt was seen as dangerous. It was thought to lead to inflation or crowd out private investments. But after 2008, those fears didn't materialize, despite large deficits. As The Economist explains, prominent economists like Oliver Blanchard, Larry Summers, and Jason Furman began arguing that in an era of low interest rates, debt might not be as risky. If the economy grows faster than the government's borrowing costs, then the debt to GDP ratio can actually shrink over time, even with ongoing deficits. Excuse me. This rethink has major implications. It suggests that governments can run larger deficits safely, especially when the economy is weak, interest rates are low, and private investments is sluggish. The lessons from 2008 shaped the government's response to COVID 19. Unlike in 2008, policymakers didn't hesitate to use massive fiscal stimulus. The U.S. ran a $3.1 trillion deficit in 2020 alone, the largest since World War II. This swift and aggressive spending helped prevent a deep economic depression, but it also helped fuel a sharp rise in inflation. For years, economists argued that large deficits were sustainable as long as inflation stayed low. The COVID response tested that theory and raised new questions. Now the debate has shifted. How much stimulus is too much? Can government keep using large deficits without risking future inflation? Today, economists and policymakers are grappling with new questions about fiscal policy. After COVID, inflation surged to levels not seen in decades. This has reignited fears that large deficits can eventually spark runaway inflation. Some economists still argue that deficits are manageable as long as inflation expectations remain anchored and government acts responsibly over the long term. But others warn that if debt levels keep rising, future interest rates could spike, forcing painful spending cuts or tax increase. The big takeaway? Fiscal policy is now recognized as a powerful tool, but it must be used carefully. Governments must find the right balance between stimulating growth and preserving financial stability. The lessons from 2008 and 2020 will shape how we respond to the next major economic shock. To wrap it all up, the 2008 financial crisis permanently changed how we think about fiscal policy. It exposed the weakness in the old models that feared debt at all costs, and showed that in times of crisis, government spending is essential to stabilize the economy. Over the past 15 years, we've seen a shift. Economists have rethought the risk of deficits, especially when interest rates are low. The COVID-19 pandemic confirmed that large fiscal interventions can work, but it also reminded us that there are real risks, like inflation, if stimulus go too far. Fiscal policy is now a first-line defense in economic crisis, not a last resort. As new challenges emerge in the future, these lessons will continue to guide how government responds to recessions, inflation, and global shocks. Here are my main two resources I used for my research and analysis, both from The Economist. These articles provided valuable insights into how fiscal policy was understood during and after the 2008 financial crisis, and how those lessons influenced the COVID-19 response. The 2008 crisis continues to influence how we think about fiscal policy today, and its lessons remain critical for managing the future economic challenges. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. I hope it provided useful insight into the lasting fiscal impacts of the 2008 financial crisis.